Right, so without further ado, let's get rolling this morning. Welcome everyone to those who are here live and welcome to those who are listening as a recording. This is the penultimate class in our year-long series, Race, Whiteness, and the Church. I'm glad that you guys could be here for the discussion today. And I want to remind you some of our goals going through this course, which is to understand more of the history of race and the experience of being Black in America, to discuss the concept of institutional racism, to understand more about how the sin of racism has impacted the health, unity, and witness of the church, and to explore how we can be a healing community at Grace. And it's really that final point that is my hope for this class and the next one in 2 weeks. Really what we've organized is for you to hear from 8 different members of our pastoral care team, so staff and deacons and elders at Grace, to hear some of the things that have been meaningful to each of them that have they've thought about, wrestled with, and taken away from this class. But even more importantly, to hear about from each of us some of our hopes for the future for Grace, for where we're headed as a community, because I think it's important that this is not just an academic exercise. It's not just something we talk about for a little while in a class and then leave it there. What we really hope to do, both in the leadership and as a whole congregation, is metabolize some of these things, make them part of ourselves and who we are going forward. So that's part of the hopes for having these discussions today. Before we start into that, though, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that this Tuesday, the 25th of May, is a year exactly since the death of George Floyd. That, you know, is a terrible tragedy. It's the story of a Black man who had his life taken from him by police officers over $20 bill. So I want us to sit with that and have a moment of remembrance. I'm just going to institute a time of silence here for a moment, and we can dwell on that. And after a few moments of silence, I will introduce our speakers for today. So as I said, we're going to have 8 ultimately leaders from Grace speak with you for today. And what I've asked each person to speak to is 2 questions. One, what is something that has been significantly impactful to you that you have learned or thought about as a result of this class? And 2, what are some of your hopes about how Grace might grow in this area and work to become a healing presence in the midst of the broken and tragic history of race in our country? And so up first, we'll have Jamie Afshari, and then following her will be Eric Hadden, and then I will share, and Adam will close us out. And after that, we're going to have some time left over for some community discussion. So without further ado, Jamie, we welcome you this morning, and you have the floor.
Thanks, Drew. It's been such a great class for me in so many ways, and I've learned so many things and been reminded of so many good things. And in a lot of ways, I thought all I bring to this discussion is my own brokenness, but also I can't sit there. I think it's more comfortable to sit and say, I'm broken, I've done things wrong, but it's really hard to move beyond that, I think. And so this class really stretched me to think about that. And so super appreciative of your leadership and taking the time to do all this, because a class like this was just essential to combine my faith and theology and practice. And, in other words, like your orthodoxy and your orthopraxy. And oftentimes I'm content to let one stand alone without the other, but this class really helped combine the two, to combine theology and theology's outworking. And a story kept coming to mind about a time it was 2003. I was working at Moody. I had just graduated from there. I was an admissions counselor, and I met with all the students that came through the door. So like 3,000 of them throughout the year, maybe more. Oftentimes I would get a phone call and they would say, "Hey, Jamie, it's John." And I'd be like, I met like 45 Johns last week. But the other person that also had my job, his name was Marcos, and he was our diversity counselor. He primarily traveled to cities around the country, and especially to the inner city and to like local churches within the inner city to recruit students to come to Moody. And at the time, I had no idea why it was a necessity. I even like asked my white friends, I just don't get this. I don't get why it's a thing, why we need this. And I had lived in Chicago now for 4 years, from graduation, or from the beginning of school to graduation. And I had been taught by our public safety officers over and over that as a woman, if I needed to stay safe and wanted to stay safe, I would only go north, or I would only go downtown towards the beach. I would never travel west, and I would never travel south if I wanted to stay safe. One day it dawned on me, like, oh, Black people live on the south side of Chicago and Latinos live on the west side of Chicago. And once it dawned on me, it reinforced the wrong belief that white neighborhoods were safer than others. And there was something that Marcos, my colleague, would often use to refer to himself as. And one day I used that phrase to him. And he asked very gently, very kindly, if we could have lunch in his office that day. And there he said he wanted for me and him to have a conversation about my use of that phrase, and just touch base with me about why his position was important, why his job was important, and why going to these places for him was really important. He was calm, he was kind, he was very honest. And he even said to me, "As your brother in Christ, I need to tell you that you are being racist, and it is unacceptable." It was like a tender 2x4 to the heart. I was so embarrassed. And he said, "Jamie, embarrassment is not going to help you, but education will. So can we keep talking about this?" And he gave me a book to read, and it's, 20 years later now, so I don't remember which one. But I read some chapters in it, and he even invited me to go along to on one of his trips with him, so that I could see the kind of work that he did and hear stories from people around the country, minority students particularly, about what they were up against in the system. And this particular conversation and that trip really started a beautiful friendship that I thank God for all the time, because it was the beginning of really where I began to see my privilege. And what really struck me about him was his kindness and willingness to tell the truth to me, because if he didn't tell the truth to me, he would have passed by an opportunity that God used in order to aid in my own sanctification. It was super risky for him to take that step, but I'm so glad that he did. Yeah. So that's why I think like the class on reparations that we had with Greg was probably the most insightful for me, because I think I have the hardest time talking, excuse me, with other evangelicals about why reparations is a good idea. Like in my head, I kind of was like, yes, but I had no education. I had no understanding. And Greg, I felt like, was another tender 2x4 to the heart. And he exposed an area where I would normally run from because I was scared to talk about it, because I was scared to say the wrong thing or scared to fumble around. And so him talking about these matters gave me words and facts for the feelings that I had. And in a way, it was, the Holy Spirit prompting me to learn so that I could enter into conversations with people who don't understand why this is absolutely biblical. And there has been precedent for it in our country in the past. And all these history books have intentionally left that out. So I feel like I still have so much growing to do. But I think this leads to your second question about why, what my hope is for myself and for Grace. And I think for me and for our church, it's that our education on these matters wouldn't be an end in and of themselves, and that our education on these matters would also not end. Because I must, and I think Grace must be a church where we own our part. And if we stop with education and never move to actually loving our city and the people around us, we ignore the call of God. And I wasn't attending Grace at the time, but last year we were listening through your Daniel series, and a verse that was kept as an anchor really for that series came from the book of Jeremiah in chapter 29. And I'm just going to read a couple of verses. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And it jogged my mind to even think of 1 Corinthians 12:26, where Paul says, if one member suffers, we all suffer. And if one member is honored, we all rejoice together. So for me to be God's people in exile is to know that God is here. It's interesting to me that no matter where Israel found herself, the commands of God didn't change. If Israel was in the land, you have to keep the law. If Israel was in exile, you have to keep the law. And a huge part of keeping the law was to care for anyone oppressed. And so there were systems all around Israel that were oppressive to women, to children, and to any foreigner that came to other nations. But Israel was supposed to be different. She was called out and to be separate and holy. She was supposed to be a safe haven for anyone who needed help to get out of their oppressive systems. But unfortunately, we know Israel, like all the other nations, was just another heavy yoke on the people, abusing the least of these. And so God sent them into exile. But even now in exile, they still had to seek the peace of the city. They still had to care for the poor, to care for the foreigner, to care for the women and children and widows. That shalom, that God called his people to, didn't have a place constraint. And so now we find ourselves as God's people in Seattle, and all around us, there's suffering and oppression. And so, as a church, I think we have to confront the systems that shackle the least of these, because when one part suffers, we all suffer. When our siblings of color are calling out to be believed and supported, and we rely on the government to do our job, we have done a grave disservice, because we can't stop with education, because our call is to do the work of repairing, of shalom, of bringing God's wholeness to the city of Seattle. And I guess that's, just where my heart kind of landed after the class. But I hope to continue to be stretched and pulled out.
Thank you for preparing that and for sharing it with us, Jamie. Those are good words. So now we'll hear from Eric this morning.
Hey everybody. Yeah, Drew, thanks for hosting this series. Yeah, it's been really impactful for me. And I guess my journey this year has been shaped not only by this class, but by a few other things. Some books that I've read, some people that I've heard from this year that I've not heard from in the past. I think, like a lot of us, I think this all was sparked by George Floyd's death, right? And George Floyd, for me, his death, other than kind of the emotional impact that seeing pieces of that video, I actually haven't watched the whole video, but seeing pieces of that video have on our hearts, his story is one that I can that I saw as somebody who grew up in College Station, Texas, which is just down the street from Houston, where George grew up. As I heard his story come out following his death, it was one that, while it was certainly not my story, it was one that I could say I had friends that lived that story. As a boy who grew up in Cooney homes, I knew and worked with kids that grew up in neighborhoods, in the projects, in College Station, that I could point to and say, yeah, this hits home for me. So I think that was kind of the initial emotional tie to kind of some work that God has done in my head and has continued to do in my heart. I think for me, what's been really impactful through this class and through some of my other readings has been just a better understanding of where we sit in the historical context, like where we sit today as Grace Church Seattle in the context of all history has been really helpful for me. And part of that was the understanding, or just the putting into perspective, that the transatlantic African slave trade was a period of time. So for me, I think that was a new concept for me to really wrap my brain around. That was a period in time, meaning for me there was a before time of the African slave trade, right? But understanding that was 3 centuries, and that's a long time that happened, right? And knowing that not only was that a long period of time, but it was also the time in which our country and a lot of our society was birthed, right? So our country and a lot of the norms that we have in this country were birthed out of that time period, that unique piece of time where people were being shipped from one part of the world to the other as enslaved people, right? So for me, that helped me to then start seeing all of these systems in America, in our society, that were built at the beginning out of this construct, the construct of slavery, and also to start understanding, that it's built not just was our system started then, but it's woven into this racism is woven into a lot of the systems that had their genesis there. So, economic, educational, criminal justice, and even our churches. So for me, starting to get a better understanding that those are things that were built in, those systems were started at that time, and racism was inherently built into those systems, was important for me to understand. And I think it's also important to understand the historical context, because we're not that far removed from the African slave trade, and we're really not that far removed from segregation, right? Like, we are one generation really removed from segregation. And so I think wrapping my brain around that has been really helpful. because it allows me to say, we're still feeling the impacts of all of that. We are not far removed, and it's still impacting us. I think it's also made me realize that there's still a lot of work that we need to do to undo the systems that happen there. And I think the analogy that comes to mind, like if you are rooting out invasive species. So I come from a background in landscape architecture. So if you are going to try to restore an ecosystem, you're going to want to root out invasive species. And that simple idea of taking things out is difficult. But then comes the part of, after you've removed the invasive species, it's the idea of cultivating new ecosystem and rebuilding that ecosystem. And all of that is a hard and long process. And so I think that's helpful for me to understand, with that understanding of our historical context. Also, I think not only are we undoing some of the systems, but like I said, we're repairing. And it's kind of like, again, there's an analogy that comes to mind, like it's not like, it's as though a hurricane has come through and we can't just say, all right, the hurricane has passed. Like we now have the work of repairing all that the hurricane has destroyed, right? So we're in this post time period of, we may be past segregation and past the civil rights movement, but there's still a lot of work to repair. So in my mind, just understanding that historical context is helpful. And again, it's in some ways hopeful to know that we are in that there was a before African slave trade. And I'll fully acknowledge that power is something that mankind is going to strive to grab a hold of, whether that's through, actions like the slave trade, segregation. And so it's not like mankind, until God is reigning, mankind is still going to be striving to grab a hold of power and to hold on to that power. I acknowledge that. But just the simple idea that, hey, the African slave trade happened, there was a before period, right? And so let's work to move past this and let's heal. Let's work for healing. So, as I look to some of my hopes for Grace in the future, I hope that through this class that we're aware of how little we know about stories of people of color. And I want us to know how little we know so that we continue our work in educating ourselves. And I also want us to seek out people of color to hear their stories. That's something in my own life that I have to do. I want us to lean into our lack of knowledge on this as a congregation that is predominantly white. I want us to be okay with that and have that spur our desire to hear more stories and to learn more. I also want us as a congregation to be present in communities of color. So because we're a predominantly white congregation, I think it's important for us to be in communities of color. And something, working with Jason and the Serving the City Committee, something that Jason talks a lot about is our posture. And a new concept for me this year is this idea that we as Grace Church can be in the position of host. So taking a posture of guest rather than host is a posture that I hope we as Grace are willing to adopt. I think it's easy to go out there and kind of have this white savior mentality. So I think for us to learn from people that are already at work in communities of color is good, and to lean into their leadership and to be a guest in their spaces is something that I hope we as Grace continue to do. Something I also think, I'll just add this is more of a question mark for me as to how we go about this, but I would love to see us hold spaces for people of color at Grace. whether that's on Sundays, whether that's in our communities throughout the week. We're again, a predominantly white congregation. We have a more traditional liturgy. How do we do that? I don't have answers to that, but I would love for us going forward to explore how we hold space for people of color at Grace, and what we need to do to change so that we can, I think it's going to require change, but so that we can hold space for people of color. So yeah, that's just a little bit of my journey and kind of some of my hopes for Grace in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric, for sharing those thoughts. All right. Well, I have, I'm going to share with you as well my thoughts on these two questions that we're engaging with. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack with the first question because I have a unique position being kind of an organizer and sometimes teacher in this whole thing. And I'm not going to address content from the classes, but get a little more meta on you, which is to talk to you about what I was feeling and facing as I started to plan for this class and as it came about and we were carrying it out. And that is fear. I had a lot of fear. I don't know if you picked up on that, but both in the planning phase and certainly in the beginning and really all throughout. And that fear sometimes came across as voices telling me, who am I to do this? I'm a middle-aged white male, right? But a lot of that fear was fear that I would say the wrong thing, that I would expose some unexamined, racist assumption in my own heart. And then I would hurt the very good that, I really wanted to work for with this class. And I've heard this kind of fear expressed from many of you in some of the discussions we've had. And I know that it's there in you because I also feel that thing in me too as a white person. And it goes beyond the context of this class. And I want to talk a little bit about the value of pushing through fear, which doesn't mean not fearing, but acting rightly in the midst of it. I've never, if you can't tell, been a brash person full of confidence, that person that was kind of held up to me as like the way a leader ought to be when I was a child. Like that in Apocalypse Now, there's that one leader, that soldier, who's just kind of strutting through this conflict zone, not even worried that as bullets whiz past him. I've never been that kind of person. And all the good things that the Lord has brought forward in my life have been when I've pressed into fear. And I think that's what we as white people need to do in matters of race. We so often hold back from addressing things with race. We hesitate and we hedge. We avoid and we sit back and just observe sometimes. And we tell ourselves that we're not experts and we feel bewildered by the problem. Oftentimes we feel overcome by guilt and shame around this issue. But there's another thing at play too, and I think it's because we're all naturally afraid of being vulnerable. And this is a very charged space to be vulnerable in. I found myself afraid every time I led these classes of saying the wrong thing and of displaying my ignorance and of displaying the work that I hadn't yet done. But I'm convinced for all of us that the way forward, the way forward for white folks like me is to push into that vulnerability, is to know that there's a high likelihood that we're going to say the wrong thing, that we're going to make mistakes, and just be humble and be willing to apologize and to enter those spaces nonetheless, because that's how healing is going to happen. It's not going to be through protecting ourselves and protecting ourselves from that vulnerability. My old boss used to say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think we just need to move in the right direction in the midst of our brokenness, in the midst of our ignorance, in the midst of our mistakes. And one thing I like for me that's been somewhat freeing is Ibram Kendi. He talks about racism in terms of racist ideas, rather than it being this big, huge thing that it's become in our society of like, you're a racist, and if you get labeled that, that's the ultimate pejorative. He even talks about himself having racist ideas that he had to work through, right? So when you change that narrative and say it's about racist ideas, and all of us, because of the society that we've been grown up in, have racist ideas that we have to work through, we're able to be to walk forward and not be paralyzed, and to face that vulnerability. And I think as Christians, we have something to bring forward into this space because we know what it is to like follow Jesus and not be morally pure. We know that we're all sinners before God, and that our only hope is in His righteousness. And I think that this is an area where, as Christians, we know that we have brokenness, and yet we can demonstrate the ability to still walk forward in this world, following our Lord and working for the good and receiving His righteousness, acknowledging full well that we don't have our own righteousness. And then it doesn't have to be this sort of performative virtue signaling, showing our social justice credibility. We can move into the fear, we can be real, we can acknowledge truth, and be humble together as we try to bring healing in this complicated and messy heritage that we've all been dealt. And then my hope for the future of Grace, my hope is actually really similar to things both Jamie and Eric mentioned, which is I want us to learn to practice listening. I want us to learn to practice listening to Black people and other people of color, whether those voices are through books or other media, or through interactions and conversations and friendships. And in the midst of that, not just listening, but believing. And this is really what I want to stress. So often we'll hear things on the news, and I just, being around a lot of white people as I am, often, there can be attitudes that we so easily just dismiss what we hear. The experience of Black people, the experience of people of color. We hear it and we dismiss it and we discount it. And I think we need to cultivate a different attitude there. We need to believe first. We need to hear, listen, and listen rushing with an attitude and a posture of believing. A few examples, for instance, CHOP, when it happened, right? You have people who want to rush to dismiss it and say, this is just a violent, it's a bunch of criminals down there breaking the law, or else it's, leftist revolutionary activity. And that kind of thing not only gets, CHOP was painted with that, but every time there's some kind of unrest around the issues of race, whether it's Ferguson, whether what happened in Baltimore, multiple times over in my hometown, white people often rush to dismiss it with these comments like, oh, well, it's just, criminal activity or revolutionary activity or whatever. But people have reasons for what they do, for what they feel and need to do, and they're big, old, hard, and complicated reasons. So I think we need to try harder to put ourselves in other people's situations. And if I had seen over and over again people that I was close to, people who were like me, not have access to justice, I would cry, I would scream, and I would probably want to tear something up too. Another example, earlier on in it was probably June or July after the death of George Floyd, I heard an NPR story about a Black mother talking about the idea of the talk and how she had to talk to her kids before allowing them to kind of go on their own. They were getting old enough to go to the park, and she explained that whole the thing of like telling them, if a police person calls out to you, don't run, don't wear a hoodie, all of this stuff, because you can't just expect that they're going to treat you like they treat white people. And it was just at the time that I heard this that my own daughter, Sabine, had just gotten the training wheels off of her bike, and we were kind of letting her ride around our neighborhood here and up to the park, which is maybe 200 yards away or something like that. And I just broke down in tears like I haven't cried in years, listening to this NPR story, feeling that difference of how I just let my daughter go. I didn't have any talk with her. I didn't have that worry at all. But other people, Black people, have a different experience, and there's a need for them to have that conversation. And I've heard from other white people who've been dismissive of that and said that that's not a good thing. It's maybe even damaging to instill fear of authority or fear of the police in your children as parents. And I want us to realize and listen and believe the experience of Black people. If they need to have that kind of talk with their children, they're not doing it as a form of entertainment. They're not doing it lightly. They're not doing it because they're Democrats and they're following some kind of talking points. They're having that very hard talk because there's a need for that talk, and we need to listen to people, and we need to believe people. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything. Just don't run to that automatic discount of what someone says. Hold someone else's lived experience that might be different than your own. Explore it for a moment, and cultivate space to hear and honor other people's stories and give respect to them. That's what I hope for myself going forward, and that's what I hope for our community here at Grace. So now, Adam, you have the floor. So about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes left for discussion at the end.
All right. Excuse me. Thanks, Drew. I do have to say I am a part of this class a little sheepishly because I have not attended Christian formation with Drew teaching, but I do appreciate the opportunity. And Drew, I'm very grateful for you and the others who have taken the time to lead us in this way to start the conversation. So thank you. Just a little bit of background on me, which informs the answer to the question of what are my hopes for Grace. So I was born in 1971 in Salt Lake City, Utah, to very young hippie parents. My mom born and raised in Utah and part of the Mormon church. My dad moved there in high school and converted, and they had left the church. But one of the things that my parents did very well with me at a young age is taught me to abhor racism. And so that's the background that I started in. And why I mention that is when I became a Christian in the late 80s, it was 1988 in Honolulu, Hawaii. I was significantly influenced by people in the church there who almost immediately started telling me that to be a Christian meant to be an ultra-conservative Republican. And so I was shifting away from, sadly, one of the very good things, and maybe only good things my parents did in my upbringing, to now being a Christian, and instead of experiencing the peace and love of Christ, being told how I now need to act now that I am confessing that I believe in Christ. And so the first third of my Christian life was, I spent 10 times more energy railing against liberalism than I did trying to talk to people about Jesus and that he makes all things new, and believing in the inherent dignity of all people because we're created in God's image. And so that continued on as I was, moving through my Christian life. And then one of the first things that started to help me realize that I was wrong in the views that I was taking, and that I was filling my head with a lot of hate with what I was listening to on the radio, and the conversations I had. Was right before I got my undergraduate degree. I had to fill one of my liberal arts classes, which I actually loved most of those, but the only one that was available was Native American literature. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go in and just get beat down for being the white guy and listen to all this nonsense about woe is me. And that class, the books that I read, the poetry, the autobiographies, the short stories, really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And particularly, it was a Sherman Alexie short story where he talked about just the pains that he feels in regular life. And the Spokane minor league baseball team is the Spokane Indians. And he just wrote about reading a headline one morning that said Indians lose again, and how that's the life that he lives in. And while I wish that I immediately was set on the trajectory of walking away from some of the nonsense I had been taught by people who influenced me earlier, it definitely is something I still vividly remember to this day, and the heartache that I felt. And then, I came to Grace in 2000. And one thing I did love about Grace is we didn't talk politics. We didn't talk views and what you believe outside of our Christian faith. But the very first thing that we wanted people confronted with was Jesus. And then Jesus and the Holy Spirit would work through us, work in us to then transform us from the inside out. But it really wasn't until 2010 when I really started to look at things more seriously in regards to race and social justice. And the reason for it was I'm a water and wastewater engineering consultant, and a friend of mine, his name was Andrew Lee, he actually went to Grace for a little bit. He said, hey, I want you to pursue work with Seattle Public Utilities. It's going to take a while because we're a massive bureaucratic agency, but I want you to start doing that. And so I did in 2010. I submitted my first proposal in maybe 2011. And as part of those, you need to write what's called an equity and inclusion, a diversity and inclusion plan to say how you're going to bring in minority and women-owned businesses as part of your teams. And the ESJ, Equity and Social Justice Director, called me after I submitted and said that was the worst diversity and inclusion plan I've ever read. And she's like, I'd love to have lunch with you. And so she sat me down and showed me what other consultants were writing. And then she showed me what I did. And it was really embarrassing. And she's like, I'm not saying that this is reflective of who you are, but she's like, I want you to read these things. I want you to pay attention to these things. I want you to hear why we do what we do. And the fact that she did that I was 40, for this 40-year-old white dude, I was just really moved by that. And so I started to pay more attention to what I was hearing in the media, what I was hearing people talking about, and what I was feeling inside. And so I've spent a bit of time in that last 10 years, trying to understand those things. And then a couple of years ago, I actually decided to go work for Seattle Public Utilities. They asked me to be their project management director. And so I did it. And one of the things that's required in your first year being a City of Seattle employee is taking classes on equity and social justice. And Jamie, I loved your tender 2x4 to the heart analogy, because it's how it felt. But I loved it. I loved what I was learning. Any of the fears that I had that I would come into these meetings and be met with judgment, none of that was real. It was we don't expect you to know these things, but we want you to listen. We want you to learn. We want you to engage. And one class in particular that really impacted me was, it was a class only available to white people. And the very first thing you did is you walked into the room, in this big conference room. There was a timeline on the back wall with significant events in history. And then we had to go put what we know of our family's history. So 400 years was American history. We had to put our Post-it notes of where we knew our family was involved in. And the whole point of it was that even though we may not believe that we believe and have been sucked into some of the systemic and institutional racism in our country, as you looked at this timeline, and we all had Post-its, like the Van Schuyler family coming to New York in the 1600s, and the Boardman and Laws families coming west into Utah to settle the Utah Valley and displace the Ute Indians. And as we looked at it, there was maybe 25 of us. It was like, wow, like we really are a part of this history. And we now are a part of this history that we can start to make change in. And then one of the beautiful ways in that God works is I really like Lecrae, the Christian rapper guy. And I particularly liked his album that had Welcome to America. And he posted on Instagram when Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise came out. And so I bought it on Amazon that day. And that was one of the most influential and sorrowful reads of my life. I would lay in bed and just cry as I was reading it. Because it was just a black and white history of the American church's complicity in racism and the poor decisions that we've made, including in 1619 when the church had an opportunity to change, I can't remember what it was in Virginia, changed the doctrine that came out about slavery, and we chose not to, and the trajectory that set us off on, it was just crushing, and that it continues to. I'm just very grateful for that. And then I'm super grateful just the patience that people have showed me through that. And so my hopes for Grace, and many of you have already talked about this, is that I want us to be a leader in regards to stepping into this place, especially, Drew, you talked about being a middle-aged white guy. It's awkward, but we need to step into it, and we need to be willing to apologize when we make mistakes and listen to the voices that are outside. I want us to be asking the questions to each other, how are we doing in regards to race and social justice, as much as we ask about how are you doing with pornography? How are you doing with anger? How are you doing with dismissiveness? How are you doing with greed and materialism? That should be a part of the conversation, not this side thing. But I don't know if anybody's asked me that in my entire Christian life. And I haven't asked that either. It's not, I'm the one guy, but I want us to do that. I want us to listen to those voices of people who are impacted by the systemic issues in our culture. I want us to give heed to the non-Christian voices that are far more wise and loving and kind. And I definitely want us to not be, we figured this out, here's how we're going to address it. But listen to those voices and welcome those voices, and see the dignity and the godliness in those people who don't, a lot are even angry towards the church because of how the church has been. And then I don't want us to just talk the way a lot of people in the church talk of, well, it's a difference of opinion. This is not a difference of opinion. This is an issue of sin. And so I was getting sucked into that and I wanted it to be unified with the church and not talk bad about my brothers and sisters. And I had an atheist friend who I'm very close with say, you're an idiot. And I'd get mad at him. And it's like, no, it's about unity. And within the last 18 months, he and I were walking around Discovery Park. And I just said, I'm sorry, Peter, you were right. I need to not be putting a false unity in front of truth and justice. And so I want us to fight against that. And I think we are. I'm so excited at what we're hearing and the voices and, the work that the Billups are doing. I mean, Sarah's work is amazing. And I'm so excited at that voice that is getting more and more loud and people are listening. And then just, wrapping up Drew said he wants this to metabolize into part of who we are. And that's what I really hope for, that this isn't just a flavor of the month topic. I'm excited because things feel different in the way we talk about it in our country. And I want us to be a part of the momentum of that. And that through that, we as individuals are transformed, and then we do transform the city the way that we talk about wanting to, as you know, as a city on the hill, on Capitol Hill. And again, just thank you all. It's honestly an honor to be able to talk to you all, to hear all of your stories in regards to this. So thank you, Drew.
Thank you, Adam, and amen. Yeah, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge Jamie and Eric and Adam and say thank you for sharing, and thank you for leading in this way for our congregation, leading the way forward as we engage in issues of race and injustice, but also leading in that vulnerability that I was talking about, because it is scary to actually be real and to talk about our own failures and fears and struggles. So I appreciate each of you showing up today. And we have about 7 minutes for discussion. And really my goal with the discussion is to put these two questions out to you all who are here joining us and listening today. Share something that's been impactful and meaningful to you in this class over the past year, and or share some of your hopes about how grace would change and metabolize some of this into who we are. Anyone speak up, don't be shy. Anyone have anything to share? Any questions for our those who've shared today, or any thoughts that you have about your experience of this class or these questions?
Yeah, I'll just quickly chime in that I'm thankful for a church that has a posture of humility and just a willingness, kind of what you were saying, Drew, to be uncomfortable and to push past that uncomfort and that fear, knowing that like this is where the Spirit is leading our church, and that there does seem to be a unique like opening of the eyes, and that we're leaning into that, trusting the Spirit as he leads us step by step. So I don't know if that's like a question or a comment or just a thought that I had.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Joy. Anyone else have something to share this morning before we adjourn?
You know, one thing I did love at SPU that they really tried to get people to live by is they called it the oops and ouch. And that as we started to engage this topic with each other, there are going to be times that, you know, we say something stupid or wrong or sinful. And Jamie, you gave the story about with you, and someone gently pulled you aside and said, hey, that was racist. That to be able to, you know, say the oops, and I'm on the oops side because there's like 14 main dominant culture categories. I'm all 14. And so like I'm the oops guy. And that we encourage people to say the ouch part of like, man, that was stupid. And to be able to live in that awkwardness and that dynamic of, hey, that hurt, and hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. And I do hope that we can get to that place, because that's how SPU has addressed the awkwardness of, hey, let's move into that. And it's hard to do that. But as people did it, you realize, hey, we really are trying to better things by interacting with each other this way. So.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, and I would also say, Jamie, it's awesome that your friend was gentle about it, but we need to make space for people to bring those things to us and it not be too, and to be okay with that.
Adam, you talking about being a part of all of these dominant cultures. Like I think grace is made up of a lot of dominant cultures, right? And so I think one of the other things that I've written down, I don't think I spoke much to, but my hope too is that grace would be able to use those positions of power that we have been given and also be thankful for that and lean into that in ways that create space for people of color, right? Now that we've been given some of that privilege, let's use that wisely.
All right, we probably have enough time for another comment if anyone has anything to share. Otherwise, we will hold our peace for now. All right, well, again, I want to thank everyone who showed up and shared today, and all of you who showed up to participate, and those who will listen as a recording. We'll have one more class. It'll be 2 weeks from today. Same questions, but for different leaders at Grace. We will have Pastor Jason, Pastor John, Rebecca Ifland, and Renee Huey speaking with us. So I do hope that you will join us for that. I also want to take a moment. Some of you may have already heard this, but one of the ways that I'm hoping we will kind of channel this desire to metabolize some of this learning and carry it forward into the future is by creating a committee. I'm not quite sure what we're going to call it yet, but essentially a committee of people at Grace who want to keep spearheading this work and working on equity and social justice issues. So stay tuned to hear more about that. But if you're interested in participating in that, or you want to hear more, or you can think of someone who you know at Grace who might be interested, talk to me, let those people know. I just want to start talking about this because we're looking forward to taking this step. Blessings to all of you and your Sunday, and we will perhaps see you at worship in a short time. Be well.